Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey man, how you doing?
I'm doing well. And joining us today is Brett Scott. Brett is the author of the out now in the UK and soon to be released in the US Cloudmoney, Cash Cards, Crypto, and the War for Your Wallets. Brett, thanks so much for joining us from
Great.
Berlin, I believe, this evening.
Berlin on a Friday night. It's great to be here.
That's
Where the party's at.
That's a great honor. So, Brett, explain folks your personal history with the whole crypto field. As you mentioned in your book, you got on the front page of Google, and that sort of led to your connection here.
I actually have a whole prior history to. Crypto is not really my starting point on money stuff. I actually worked in the financial sector, in the world of over-the-counter derivatives. I don't know how much you guys have explored the world of derivatives, but I suspect you're aware of it. But so I worked in the financial sector during the financial crisis, albeit I came from a very left-wing background. So I had this sort of strange position of being this quite politically left-wing person in finance. And that led to me later then writing a book called The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance for activists during the sort of Occupy time. I was approached and asked to write a book for activists on how to approach the financial sector and how to sort of understand what was going on. So that was my first book, came out in 2013 with Pluto Press in London. And that sort of led, around that time, I was also exploring lots of sort of alternative currency systems, alternative banking systems, just general sort of alternative stuff more generally. And slowly over time, I basically kind of got drawn into many different areas around thinking about monetary systems and also the intersection between big tech and finance in the realm of like financial technology. So I guess for about 8 years or so, I was just sort of exploring different stuff and doing different things around that. Eventually, it led to the sort of cryptocurrency stuff. But I wouldn't really define myself in terms of, crypto. It happens to be one of the things I have been involved in and I talk about a lot. But it's only it's a fairly limited part of my overall repertoire, should I say. But I was personally involved, and in the early days of Bitcoin in the London Bitcoin scene, I did experiment quite a lot with it. I was involved in the early scene, and I wrote some of these blog posts. And so you mentioned getting on the first page of Google, which is something I mentioned in the book. It's kind of how in the early days of Bitcoin, it was so easy to kind of sort of integrate into the scene because it was so small. I wrote this really sort of like, just a sort of basic blog explaining it, and then I just somehow happened to get picked up on the front page of Google, and then I started getting all these invites from the BBC to talk about it, and like this is literally how it worked in the sort of early days of Bitcoin. It was just if you happen to be the person talking about it. But since then, I'm kind of become known as quote unquote a crypto skeptic, aka somebody who doesn't just evangelize Bitcoin. So
Right.
yeah, that's part of what the book is talking about, but my new book, but it's obviously broader.
Yeah, and I think that's what I really like is we've been labeled the whole Bitcoin skeptics around here a little bit too, but what I like is a lot of what we've been doing is debunking certain claims made by Bitcoin proponents, and you mentioned one in the book about like, oh, this is going to help solve hunger in some way, or this is what people in Gaza need to help secure finance and stuff like that. But I think what your book does sort of that brings the argument a little bit forward is shows why certain really powerful interests in society, whether tech or finance, might be interested in this sort of thing. And so let's go. Let's start first with some fundamental stuff. Now, you talk about not liking the analogy of money as a bloodstream. Can you just explain like how we should think about money a little bit before we get into digital money, cloud money?
Metaphor is always a potentially dangerous thing to play with. And I write a newsletter called Altered States of Monetary Consciousness, in which I play with a lot of metaphor around money and explore different types of metaphor, different sort of ways you can visualize the monetary system. And bear in mind that metaphor is often, it's like a visual technology in a sense, right? You're thinking of something you can almost, when I say like a nervous system or like a bloodstream, you're thinking about this visual imagery. So metaphor is quite a sort of powerful thing for explaining systems that are otherwise invisible to people, right? But historically in economics, the dominant metaphor they often use, or people often use for money, is like a bloodstream. So when I worked in finance, a lot of the financiers like to sort of think of themselves as being, the beating heart of the economy. They say, "Oh, we pump money to the industries, and without us, nothing would happen. We're the sort of heart, as it were." And so this whole sort of idea of money being some kind of like substance of value that flows, you can think about all the monetary language. It's very sort of substance based. It flows, you store it. There's all this kind of like stuff, right? And I sort of reject that in favor of a nervous system metaphor. And actually, I think, people on the sort of left can sometimes appreciate this, because there's often a recognition, especially among sort of Marxist styles of circles, that the underlying, if you want to call it, a source of value in an economy is human beings, right? And ecosystems. So basically, human beings working with things around them, right, is the underlying source of the actual value. Without that, you got nothing. So if I was to use a blood metaphor, and again, these metaphors are a bit like loose, but I would say, hey, that's where the sort of like, value or the blood of an economy is. But you can think of monetary systems and the financial systems that are built on top of them as being almost like a nervous system that plugs into that, right, and sort of mobilizes. So that is true. So the financial sector can claim that it designs contracts that can mobilize people, but it is not the actual source of value. The people are the source of value. But certainly what financial institutions are often doing is trying to sort of mobilize people into action via these systems of essentially credit and claims that we have on each other. So a lot of my sort of monetary metaphors is around nervous system metaphors. One last thing I might say about that is that this sort of ties into, I guess, in sort of old economics, they often imagine economies as these sort of made up of solo individuals who are sort of bumping into each other. But a lot of, new wave thinking on economics is, you're imagining that we're all stuck in interdependent networks, where this whole sort of enmeshed sort of superorganism, as it were. We're all having to work together to build stuff, right? And that's the actual like body of an economy, as it were. And then you can imagine the sort of monetary system kind of entrenched and sort of interlocked within that. And if you make interventions into the monetary system, you can sort of move different parts of the economy, right? And that's sort of, so nervous system metaphors I way prefer to blood metaphors. But, I've actually had friends who disagree with me on this, but, so.
Yeah. Well, I just think it's useful to like push back at some like grand narratives that are pushed out by like proponents of this sort of thing. And another one of those we can move to now is this sort of techno-progressive mythos or narrative that finance gives us. And you've been in finance for some time, so if you could just give us a little bit of history of that sort of leads us up to the push for cashlessness.
So what you mean? You mean the kind of whole sort of financial technology kind of drive it?
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah, look, so in the, I guess in the way I would tend to picture this, or how I've personally experienced this, is that I was working in the financial sector during the financial crisis. And I remember the whole kind of, how the narrative unfolded. At that time in, say, 2008, the big tech companies were viewed quite uncritically, really. They still had this sort of glow about them. Google was still seen as this like, don't do evil type of entity and so on, at least in the sort of, dominant public imagination. Whereas the banking sector and the financial sector were like the baddies, that was like, and the sort of narrative developed in the public domain, at least in certain circles, which was this idea that, okay, well, one of the ways to sort of sort out finance is to sort of, technology will somehow do it, right? Like, and a lot of the early rhetoric around what's now called fintech or financial technology was this idea that would democratize finance, right? It was going to be this thing that would give greater access and so on, right? So the sort of like tech narrative started creeping in, and lots of fintech companies sort of traded on this idea that they were kind of revamping finance and so on. Fast forward now, 10 years or so, and that's the big tech companies are now massively powerful. They're more powerful than a lot of the finance companies are, or at least they have greater market value than many of them do. And this narrative is now super, mainstream. This idea that financial technology is the future, everyone will be using digital money, and so on, and that this represents great progress. But one of the big things I'm trying to get across in the book is that, and I'm not the first person to necessarily make this observation, but I guess I'm focusing it in on finance, which is that all this apparent convenience and speed and efficiency that you're supposed to get with digital technology comes at the expense of massive centralization of power. All right. And in particular, when you start to fuse together large financial institutions with large tech institutions, you get some real chokeholds in our life, it's one thing when you sort of are dependent on some tech company for some form of information, right? But when that's then attached to the ability to act in a market through the use of money, that becomes even more powerful. So when you have big tech companies, big finance companies being required before you're able to transact, which is what you need with digital money, that becomes a huge vector via which power can be exercised. So a lot of the book is sort of looking at that, how that situation has come about and what the consequences of that are.
And I mean, I just to add to this, I'm curious, like, how much of a role do you think the kind of general mystification that most people feel to the financial system, in particular, like central banking systems, plays a role in this, right? Because, I see, at least from people who might get into crypto or kind of alternative financial mechanisms on the left, a lot of them is out of like a real skepticism of the Federal Reserve, right? Which is not necessarily outlandish, right? We know where the Federal Reserve pumps money into. Look at the United States after COVID. They're very happy to pick up debt for big corporations, and the flows of money weren't really going to everyday people from there. But how much of a role do you think this kind of mystification of money and general finance plays into the the kind of wish for a easy solution or like a technical solution to these problems?
Yeah, it plays a very big role, I'd say. Actually, I mean, it's like one of the major issues you have in the public domain is, there's very, very poor education around monetary systems, and it actually stems largely from the economics discipline. Normal mainstream economics has very poor descriptions of money. I don't know if you probably heard of David Graeber, who, before he died, I used to, he's certainly one of the people who's influenced me a lot. But just generally, a lot of the kind of, there's a whole sort of alternative schools of monetary thinking that have challenged dominant thoughts, economic thought. But, your sort of standard economic thought, which is sort of filtered into sort of media, politicians, schools, and so on, basically sees money as this kind of like, generic substance or value, right? That's what I was kind of getting at the beginning, right? These blood metaphors. It doesn't really even make distinctions between different types of money that we find. All right. And one of the big things about the politics of money is knowing the different players who are involved in issuing money in a standard system. And just bear in mind, I just want to make a distinction here between, this was occurring before the crypto thing happened. Okay. But just to sort of fast forward a bit, a lot of crypto hype is partially dependent upon these poor understandings of money. Okay, so that's partially how it can take off so easily, is it sort of trades on a lot of the sort of standard thinking about money. But this is just like, reverse a bit out of the crypto thing. People often don't understand the distinction between cash and digital money in the form of, the sort of your bank deposits, right? So the money you're using when you're using your credit card. And those are two different forms of money. And the first one's issued by the state. The second one isn't. The second one's issued by private commercial banks. It's a separate form of money. And that's actually, that fact alone is poorly understood in the public. It's actually poorly understood among many sort of progressives and stuff on the left, albeit I'd say in the US, monetary understandings got kind of better in the last, little while. Partially through the influence of the MMT movement, which has kind of brought more sort of like debates about money into the American left. But in many other parts of the world, this is still not really like very well understood, these different, the sort of dynamics of monetary systems. But for example, in this debate around cashless society, which is partly what I'm looking at a lot, one of the reasons why people frequently can't see the politics is they don't make a distinction between cash and digital money. They just think digital money is some sort of upgrade to cash, whereas actually it's an entirely separate system. And it's the only part of the monetary system that's actually the sort of government money system, right? So we can go into that if you want. But like the move, for example, to a cashless society is actually the privatization. It's the sort of full privatization of money, right? Because you're basically moving to the system of, well, in the book, I use this metaphor of digital chips. Should I explain that?
Yeah, that'd
be great. That'd be great.
All right. Because actually, it's quite a good metaphor. Again, metaphors are dangerous, but one of the sort of primary metaphors I'm using to try and illustrate this distinction and the politics of money in the sort of normal monetary system is I use the sort of metaphor of a casino. So imagine you walk into a casino, you hand over cash at the counter, and the casino gives you chips, right? Those chips are essentially a second tier form of limited purpose money you can use within a casino. All right. You can take them back to the cashier and redeem them back for cash. Now, that metaphor isn't actually that far off from what the digital money system that we use. And when you say, for example, when you're using your debit cards or credit cards or whatever, right? Any kind of like unit you see in your bank account is essentially a digital chip issued to you by your bank, which you can use internal to the ecosystem, right? So when we're talking about a cashless society, what you're talking about is a system where you're using these privately issued bank, digital chips, as it were, all right? And that gives them lots of power, it gives them lots of data, it gives them the ability to stop you, all sorts of things it gives them the ability to do, all right? And there's also a sort of a power shift that's occurring when you start to move towards that system. And the cash system is the the cashless society, if you want to think about it, it's a system where you basically cannot exit the banking system. It's when you cannot exit the casino. You're permanently stuck in that ecosystem. And so a lot of the sort of politics emerges from that.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit, kind of combine a couple things. The virtues of cash and why big tech and finance are motivated to move on from it.
The virtues of cash and why. Okay. Well, this has many like levels, but in terms of like the virtues of cash, it's the only form of public money people have access to. All right. It's the de facto the only form of I was going to say state money, but I know in the US sometimes this word state is mistaken. Well, I use a different use of the term, so I just say government money. If I was in the UK, I'd say state money. But let's say it's the only form of government money you can access. So using that casino chip analogy again, all the digital money, these digital chips. So cash is the only form of public money you can access, and that alone is sort of one in terms of it's a public utility. All right, it doesn't depend upon private corporations essentially to mediate in its movement. Right. It preserves privacy. It's resilience. One of the big things is its resilience, right? So, the Federal Reserve, for example, when a hurricane's about to hit the US, records a huge increase in the demand for cash, precisely because people just realize you want offline money, right? So there's a big resilience aspect of cash. It's also just inclusive. You don't need it. There's no criteria for using it. So, I mean, obviously you need income, but like it doesn't discriminate between people. But obviously what's going on in terms of what's happening in finance and tech is there's a few different things. I mean, banks control the underlying infrastructure of the digital money system, right? So the whole system for moving money between bank accounts is part of their business model, right? So of course, any move where you're having greater reliance upon that is in the interest of the banks. Bank of America's CEO has openly said this. He just says, we want a cashless society. We control the infrastructure. Of course, we want the cashless society. So it's pretty simple for them. And of course, then all the sort of intermediary companies like Visa and MasterCard who basically specialize in telling the banks who wants to move money between accounts. They're like outrageously anti-cash. I mean, it's a direct competitor to them. I don't know if you guys saw that, like Visa entered into a deal with the NFL to basically force people to use digital money at the Super Bowl. And that this thing goes on until 2025. They basically got a chokehold. They've just grabbed this, public, this much loved public event, and they're using it essentially to push Visa. So NFL and Visa are collaborating essentially to push people into the banking in a sort of private payment system, and basically demonizing cash. Yeah. And so, but let me just say, I'm probably going on too long here, but let me just zoom out one more step here. There's very sort of direct commercial interests like the banking sector and the payments industry. But if you zoom out and look at the big tech companies, there's a sort of more indirect interest in the sense that large-scale digital corporate capitalism cannot operate with cash. Like Amazon hates cash. You can't automate systems with cash. It sort of grinds and it sort of stands in the way, right? And if you're sort of doing a kind of like meta-analysis, of a global economy, and you say, if you're imagining it as kind of like inhuman sort of like large-scale structure that has some kind of intent of its own, you could imagine that like corporate capitalism would want to destroy cash. Right? It sort of like slows things down. Human beings actually value cash, but corporations don't. It's like switch us to Visa and MasterCard. It's much easier. So at some big meta level in the economy, people who are trying to fight for the right to use cash, in a sense, are going against the grain of big tech and big finance, right? Because they can't integrate when you have cash.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things that I just want to underline there. Like the privacy concern, that always didn't quite make sense to me, given like what I understood of the blockchain, and it seemed to be like a register where it seems a little bit antithetical to privacy. Maybe I don't understand that fully, but like cash is very clearly what you would want if you want like authorities not knowing what you're doing with your money, right? It's not reporting to a database somewhere.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. And the offline money, I mean, David's in Texas now. We talk about blackouts and stuff like that. Like, and then you're going to worry about how to get cash. It's crazy that we're going full steam ahead at a time where you look at the infrastructure that civilization is built upon, and it doesn't seems to be a little bit of maintenance, maybe.
Climate change,
No, and I'm just adding to this. Like, I was at a taco stand the other day here, and the internet went down, and the entire operation shut down. Right, and like they had the food, they had the people with money, but they weren't accepting cash at this venue. They, it's card only.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those things where it's like technology gets you into a place where something that people have been doing for thousands of years, exchanging money for food at a stall on the street, like just completely shut down. It was inaccessible.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the dynamics of this, if you want to go into the monetary politics, is that central banks should be aggressively promoting cash. Central banks won't do this because they're public institutions. Well, they see themselves as like, well, it's not our job to promote cash, all right. But on the other side, there's a gigantic industry promoting, cards, apps, all this kind of stuff, right? So there's a hugely uneven playing field. But once you push that process too far and you let the cash system get trampled on, you kind of have these feedback loops where it starts to kind of like, in London, I was just in London. It is the whole city is basically transforming into this quote unquote cashless, aka bank dominated society, right? Where you can't interact unless you've got this bank account and you're constantly like basically asking banks to intermediate on your behalf, which is, that's what the cashless society is. And it's just, I can see how that makes business sense for the banking sector, but it's from a resilience perspective, it's terrible. All right. You just have, one outage and everything goes down. And one of the best sort of metaphors I actually use for the cash system is, a lot of proponents in the financial technology world are trying to paint cash as like the horse cart of payments. It's like, come on, it's old. Whereas I say, it's like the bicycle. People love bicycles. Bicycles preceded, cars, but they're very good in terms of balancing out a system. You want multiple forms of transport. You want multiple forms of payment as well, and especially in terms of resilience. And I don't know if you guys know Rowan Gray is a sort of he's quite a big MMT guy. Rowan had another good way of putting it, which was like, you might like elevators in a large, tall building, but that doesn't mean you want to take out the emergency stairs.
Right.
Like, fine. I understand people might like an app or whatever. I'm not judging that, but that doesn't mean you want the end of an alternative, right? And to keep that requires public action, all right? And that's partially. But bear in mind, that's more than just resilience here. We're talking about maintaining a public utility, right? So yeah.
Yeah, and I also want to move kind of relatedly. You address banking the unbanked arguments, and and then you have a section on sort of the imperial dynamics of a cashless society. Can you just touch on that for folks? Because we get a lot of folks saying, Bukele is going to bank the unbanked with crypto, and isn't that good? And you define it as a type of enclosure that we should actually keep an eye on.
Well, look, it's always important to make a distinction between either the crypto world and the sort of mainstream fintech world. I mean, I partially think of that because in the book I've structured it as, I kind of bring in crypto towards the end as bear in mind in the crypto self-image, a lot of, Bitcoiners, for example, imagine themselves as the counter to the sort of tech finance enclosure. So in the first part of my book, I'm actually talking about this like, mainstream finance and tech, like who control the normal sort of like card systems and all this kind of stuff, right? Apple Pay, all this kind of thing. This is sort of mainstream finance and tech. That's the kind of like tech finance enclosure. That's what the cashless society essentially, it's at least an initial imagination, that's what it is, right? The sort of crypto world, a lot of people in the early crypto kind of circles back in the 90s and stuff, sort of cypherpunks, were looking ahead and saying, okay, if that carries on, there's going to be problems. You're going to have these big, surveillance issues and so on, centralization of power. And some of the original cypherpunks were people basically working on imagining a future cashless society and saying, what would we do in that situation to have private payments? So a lot of the innovations that came together to form things like Bitcoin come from this sort of imagination. So a lot of people in the Bitcoin world, for example, still imagine themselves as forming this like counterpower, saying, okay, well, if the world's going to be swallowed by tech and digital stuff, let's create an alternative vortex, all right, to do that. Now, so that's just sort of one like meta thing to bear in mind, although those two worlds are starting to fuse together. But yeah, in terms of this narrative around the unbanked, which you now find in both the crypto world and the sort of mainstream tech finance world. Yeah, it's a very tricky issue because, okay, how do I put this? Like, if it's true that you are stuck in a world where you will be discriminated against if you do not have a bank account, then sure, you might experience yourself being empowered if you're suddenly given a bank account. But ideally, you don't want to get into a position where you have to have these things, So there's a whole sort of like framing issue going on with this question. It's like there should be public infrastructures that form an alternative to having to use these things. But fine, if you don't have those and you're stuck in a system where like you'll be discriminated against if you don't, that you're sort of forced to find a way to onboard yourself into the banking sector. This is how actually a lot of banks frame their profit motive as some kind of like charitable thing, all right? In the UK, where I was living for quite a while, there's all these news stories would come out about how people would be stranded if they didn't have bank accounts in a cashless society. And banks use that to then ask government to subsidize them to get new customers. Say, everyone needs to be onboarded into our systems, otherwise they're going to be excluded. Help us get new customers, basically, right? And that narrative, which is quite like a neoliberal type of framing, which is basically saying the state should be helping these private corporations get new customers, is often what financial inclusion is, all right? So this sort of like banking the unbanked concept. Now, it's politically hard to argue against it because, yes, like if you are subject to the dominance of the banking sector, yeah, you are going to feel it if you don't have a bank account. But like you kind of need to like somehow get out of the narrative, or at least be able to see around it, because it's very sort of, and of course in the crypto world, they've now taken on the same language, but now I've just sort of imported it into crypto.
Right. And I mean, we always get really frustrated here when, crypto solutions are put forward when there are an actual solutions available, like postal banking. Like you just have exactly, and you have even Democratic, lawmakers saying, we got to look into this crypto thing, when just right over here is the stuff that like has actually been sitting stagnating in lawmakers on lawmakers' desks for years now.
But before we go on too much, I just want, if you don't mind, just sort of breaking this down for folks. Like when you're talking about people being customers to the bank, right? Like I think sometimes people sort of don't understand what that relationship is. Like, you give money to the bank and they give you back an IOU, and then they have access to your capital effectively, right? Like this is like an incorporation of a lot of already existing transactions and money that is existing out. And I'm talking about cash here, in the public sphere, that they're basically trying to incorporate into their systems so that they can use for different things, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, like, don't just get too technical here, but like, just bear in mind that all those systems like Venmo, whatever, all those are built upon the account infrastructure of the banks. Okay, so, and I get that metaphor of digital chips is very useful. Like banks are able to issue digital chips, which are very confusingly then referred to as bank deposits. Okay, but it's just like a very like misleading way of thinking of them. Just think about them as digital chips. All right, so yeah, like this whole move towards quote unquote the cashless society is essentially the society where you have to have a bank account because you need this ability to have these chips, and a lot of the sort of a lot of these sort of apps that look like they're not banks, like Venmo and stuff, are actually plugged into the banks. So they're like a kind of third tier institution plugged into the banks, which are plugged into the central bank. And in the book, I'm kind of going through these distinctions in the sort of monetary system. But yeah, I mean, this is the whole kind of thing. And one of the most powerful aspects of banks, and this is a complex topic, but they have the ability to issue many more of these chips than they have in actual reserves of cash and state money. And that's what sometimes was referred to as fractional reserve banking. They basically have the ability to sort of issue credit into the economy in the form of these new chips. And that's like a whole debate in itself about the power they have to essentially create most of the money supply. All right. So yeah, this is often not very well understood in the public. Many people still sort of, partially due to economics, have this idea that, you kind of put your money in the bank and they store it sort of stored there. It's like, this is not how banking works at all. But certainly that's the metaphor used, is people imagine it's just like a storekeeper. Yeah.
You
Did
mentioned,
that clarify anything, or did I just complicate things?
No. I think that's important. I mean, it can get complicated quickly, but I think dispelling that kind of common sense understanding of this is important for people to understand the motivation as to why there's such an interest in incorporating people into a cashless society, right? It's not just out of the benevolence of their own heart that they're like, oh yeah, what, you work hard for your money, we want to protect it with our guards here. They want your money in their system.
No, for sure. I mean, it takes a little while to kind of like get your head around the different, demystify different elements of the monetary system. But yeah, definitely never rely on the economics discipline to talk about this. Partially, again, I'm circling back. All those like substance ideas, those sort of like money is blood ideas that they often have, lead to these like quite like substance-based metaphors. I put it in the bank. The bank puts it somewhere else. And this is just like not how money works at all. Like it's banks are like writing essentially legal contracts into being, which are creating new money and stuff. It's not blood-like at all. We can discuss the nitty-gritty of that, but maybe it'll get to.
Or people should check out the book. I think you do a pretty good job.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You mentioned the sort of coming together of both the crypto and the more like fintech establishment side, and I feel like that you can see that in the Zuckerberg family. Like Randy Zuckerberg is a very big Ethereum booster. And Mark, could you give us the case study of what Facebook? Because I remember being freaked out about this like 4 years ago when Facebook was going to do their Libra currency. Yeah. What happened there, and where did that lead to?
I got a personal angle on that story because actually I was working on a project called Decode when Libra was announced, and Decode was a initiative funded by the European Union, or one of the sort of innovation funds of the European Union, to try actually build out counterpower to big tech. The EU is a strange body. Like in some ways, it's very basically like a market enabler, right? They're very sort of like pro-corporate. But there's these strange parts of the EU apparatus, the European Union apparatus, which fund research into alternatives. So they were basically funding a whole group of people to sort of think about how you build out different alternatives to big tech using some blockchain architectures. I won't go into that, but what happened is actually Facebook came in and poached one of our teams, one of our sort of technical teams, and basically incorporated them into the Libra project. All right. So, and Libra was Facebook's attempt to create, quote unquote, its own cryptocurrency. But basically what it was is it's like, I should go into the world of should I explain stable coins? Is that
you might as well, because I was going to ask for your reaction to the recent stablecoin stuff. So yeah, give us your stablecoin.
Well, let's put it this way: PayPal is actually probably the easiest way to understand this stuff, like or Venmo, or these types of and what these essentially are if you think about cash as being first tier money or like first level money, it's like direct government money. And then using that casino metaphor, you think of like a chip. Let's say you hand cash to a bank. It issues you a digital chip. Now that's what you see in your bank account. You see like, 1,000 or something there, right? Those are chips issued out by the bank. Now, a third institution like PayPal can then take the bank chips and issue you its own chips. All right. So what you see in your PayPal balance is a sort of third tier chip, so they're all like chained together, or they're all tethered together essentially, right? And that's what's, PayPal's is just they just call it an e-money provider. But what's called stable coins is basically the same thing, except that this chip is recorded on a blockchain network rather than in PayPal's data centers. Okay, so stable coins initially were these kind of like, if you should use a sort of physical metaphor, imagine like a kind of black market promises for ordinary money, right? Mm-hmm. I can actually make you a stable coin right here just by like taking a piece of paper and writing out like, I promise you $1,000 in my bank account, right? That's a stable coin. Basically, it's a third tier IOU promising you money in my bank account, which in turn is promising you state money from the ATM, right? You can sort of see the chains. So the stable coins were this new system for like creating these third tier promises, and then or third tier IOUs, as it were. And Facebook realized it could do the same thing, right? It's a lot of what I'm going into the book, and towards the end, I'm looking at the corporate co-optation of blockchain technology, where these corporates realized actually you could use a modified version of the same technology to run these sort of private versions of blockchain technology. Okay. Wait, I need one little detour here to sort of clarify that for people. One of the original promises made by the blockchain technology community in Bitcoin was this idea that a whole network of people who don't know each other could coordinate action between themselves without requiring a central party, right? So you can issue tokens and move them between yourself without requiring the central party. And that's what the sort of technology does. But bear in mind, if you're a corporate cartel, you're having to coordinate stuff between yourself all the time. Supply chains, big corporates, they run these big, consortiums of different players. They're not solo players. They have many sort of partners and stuff. So a lot of corporates started thinking, hey, we could use a version of this technology to coordinate our oligopolies. Why not like just make a new version of blockchain technology where you basically can banks do syndicated loans and sort of they do lots of stuff together a lot of the time, right? So they just realized they could use this version of this technology to coordinate themselves. And Facebook did the same thing. It said, hey, let's use a consortium blockchain to issue some kind of promise, a PayPal-like unit, which they would call Libra. I hope this is not getting too complicated. The main difference was that they had it backed by multiple currencies rather than a single currency. So in the PayPal example, just like imagine you had a PayPal account with like 5 different currencies in it, and then you just like collapse them together into a single unit. All right. But in the background, it's backed by these 5 different currencies, but you're like branding it as a single thing. And that was Libra, right? It was like pretending to be its own currency, but really it was like plugging into in the background to commercial banks and central banks. And a lot of the concern from central banks was kind of about this like loss of visibility in what would happen in the monetary system. Because if everyone was trying to move these units around, a whole bunch of background movements between different currencies would have to be occurring somewhere in the system. So yeah, that's an initial very long description. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, and you also mentioned, just while I remember it, and you brought up PayPal there. I did not know the relationship between PayPal and Palantir. And basically, like you mentioned, like PayPal and Thiel figuring out that you can use AI to detect fraud.
Sure, yeah. Palantir comes out of...
Use that for crime.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's it. Joe Lonsdale, who is Palantir's co-founder, was given the task at PayPal of automating crime detection or fraud detection, essentially, right? These huge corporations basically, there's like, they love automation precisely because it's just like so hard to deal with like millions of transactions. So that was came out of PayPal, and then basically Lonsdale was funded by Thiel to build out the same model for national security. So how do we use AI and stuff to form some kind of like AI robo police kind of system?
Yeah. I mean, great stuff.
And of course, ironically, Lonsdale also funds a bunch of like libertarian seasteading projects and stuff like that, which is of course like, the irony is like hilarious, but
it's almost hard to really like fully grasp the amount of ironies that go with the like tech libertarian mindset.
Sure.
You gonna say something, David?
No, I was just going to say with those guys, I think eventually you have to just realize that there's not too much internal coherence, and I think they're just throwing money around, hoping that one of these projects sticks.
The coherence is the profit motive, really. It's like, I mean, the last thing Thiel was like funding, he funded like, he's at PayPal, he's at Palantir, started funding like Silas Cybin, he started funding like Bitcoin mining. I mean, it's just like anything basically, like, and then you can sort of just like loosely string together some kind of ideological coherence if you want. But I mean,
make yourself crazy.
I wanted your perspective on this recent crypto crash that we've seen in like a month ago, and where we go from here with like the war on cash and what we can do to try to preserve cash in our lives.
Well, to be honest, I didn't really follow the crypto crash that much. I mean, I've been involved in crypto for since 2011 or something, and I kind of got bored of all the crashes, to be honest. It's like I'm supposed to care every single time it happens, but I'm like, oh, whatever. It's just like another one, right? It's hardly surprising, albeit that the same reactions happen every single time, which, to be honest, is like you see through the history of capitalism. It's not like anything particularly new. So I kind of like almost resist analyzing them. I'm like, well, it's a shoddy system that broke, and people sort of were like shocked. I didn't, in terms of like the last one with the sort of lunar system and stuff, like I didn't actually follow the details of it. I mean, but basically, if you want the sort of like high level version of this, I was describing the sort of stable coin systems earlier, which is essentially these kind of like a looser version of PayPal, right? Third tier promises for dollars issued on these like blockchain networks rather than in PayPal's data centers. Okay. And historically, the original versions of those were actually like backed by dollars in a bank account somewhere. But then there's a second type of stable coins came out, which they were basically they're called algorithmic stable coins, which is basically like you take a bunch of other cryptocurrencies and you sort of trade them in such a way that you maintain, you kind of like replicate through a bunch of sort of trading dynamics a unit that will track the dollar. Okay. And that model is subject to all manner of instability and risks. And basically that last crash was related to something like that. But I was in the midst of doing many other things and I couldn't follow all the details. Plus, a lot of the people who are involved in it now are so like obnoxious that just like trying to follow it and listen to what they're saying is just like, you know.
Yeah. On that point, just to spell out, like, you already sort of talked about the early post-Occupy libertarian influence, but like now it's gone mainstream, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, like the sort of crypto world in a way, like what's become now is very different to what it was. The waves of crypto in the beginning, if you think it was basically just Bitcoin, right? And people was quite sort of curious. It was quite playful. There was a kind of like libertarian conservatism there, but it wasn't necessarily the only type of person who turned up at a Bitcoin meetup. The people were just curious and so on. Like, and so that was the sort of first wave, was this kind of more sort of fun experimental type of phase. And also the tokens didn't really have a price, right? So there wasn't this whole like crazy speculative mania around them. And the sort of second phase is when they started to get traded a lot more, and then sort of speculators started coming in and the hype started building. So around 2013, you started to find a lot more of these sort of stories about Bitcoin coming out. And then about 2015, Ethereum came out. So that was where the kind of sort of second wave of blockchain stuff comes out, where it's like more sophisticated blockchain systems where you can do more sophisticated things. And since then, around 2017 was like the ICO boom, where people were basically selling all these like scammy, fraudulent, like pseudo shares for companies that basically didn't exist, right? And then from then, it's just been like went super mainstream, right? So in the last couple of years, it became just like a dominant thing. I was just in London, and on the like underground train system, there's like massive adverts now for like crypto trading. So it's like, okay, it's now being swallowed by market systems. It gets totally incorporated. And so, of course, the political character has changed somewhat. Lots of people who are trading crypto really don't necessarily care that much about its politics. But that said, I find it also extremely concerning in some ways, because a lot of young people who get loosely involved in crypto also sort of loosely pick up some of the forum sort of standard ideology of it, which is basically like right wing. And I get like blockchain people don't like to hear that because they say I'm progressive, blah blah blah. But like when push comes to shove, you have to distill the monetary ideology, not the technological one. It is definitely conservative. All right, this whole fixation on like holding the money supply tight and all stuff. It's very conservative. It's like super hawkish kind of stuff, right? And what's sort of quite sort of politically insidious about things like Bitcoin is that it actually has one radical component, which is the underlying technology, which is the decentralized network system, but it uses that to implement something very conservative. So it's able to capture people's sort of radical imagination with the decentralized architecture, but then sort of shoehorns or Trojan horses in this very conservative idea about money. All right. So you have all these like 16-year-olds who are like quoting Hayek at you now, right? Which is, for me, politically concerning. Although for Hayek lovers, is like a gigantic bonanza of sort of new potential acolytes.
Right.
I could go into more of this, but in a way, you've got to separate out the ideology of Bitcoin from the reality. The reality is it's actually just like an object you trade on markets. And that's not new in capitalism. I mean, that's been going on forever, right? If you want, you can critique that speculative part of it. You can, just like I can critique, GameStop shares or whatever. But like, I'm not actually that concerned about the speculation part. All right? People speculate. What I'm mostly concerned about is the ideological part of it. All right, the sort of marketing story it has in order to compete on the speculative market.
Yeah.
Which is this very conservative viewpoint of money.
Yeah, and you mentioned David Columbia in your book, and he sort of had this critique for a while, and like I do find it horrifying that we've moved to a world where crypto is on the on basketball stadiums, and
exactly.
and all these
all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, and it's like all these people, like you say, like are getting indoctrinated into basically a hard money sort of like libertarian utopian or dystopian, whichever way you want to go, line of thought, just based on their experience with these sort of assets.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite, for me, it's particularly frustrating because I've worked on lots of alternative money systems and stuff prior to crypto, which often have better understanding of money, and to sort of see this system like gain such prominence is quite like distressing when you're thinking about like how do you get people to think more critically about monetary systems. This is hard to like pass out because how do I put this? What Bitcoin's really good at doing is parasiting off monetary imagery. All right, it's very, very good at like it's like a shapeshifted kind of like thing. It's sort of it can like disguise itself. And that, in a way, is a massive success. A lot of previous attempts at creating some of these like alternative systems haven't been able to do that. But Bitcoin basically is able to sort of incorporate itself into speculative markets by pretending that it's money. Okay, what it is it's not actually like that different to any other speculative thing you buy and sell for money. But most other speculative things you buy and sell for money don't market themselves as being money. All right. Yeah. So if you think about it, like if I have $1,000 that I can choose to speculate on something, and I have on the one hand like GameStop shares, and on the other hand Bitcoin. GameStop will market itself as being like, okay, it's a share, it's a legal claim on the profits of the company, it's going to go up, whatever. You can decide that. Whereas what does Bitcoin use? I mean, essentially, Bitcoin's a digital object. That has no other marketing ability other than to call itself money, right? So people are kind of like stuck in this halfway between imagining that it's a speculative object and another that it's actually a monetary system. And that's where all the problem comes in with Bitcoin. Is it's basically just this kind of like shape-shifting thing.
Yeah.
Well,
Brett, I really recommend the book, Cloudmoney, Cash, Cards, Crypto, and the War for Our Wallets. It's out now in the UK, comes out in the US on July 5th. Thanks so much. Oh, you can follow him at, is it Suit Possum?
Suit Possum, yeah.
Suit Possum.
It's a long story behind that. I won't go into it.
I kind of figured, yeah. Suit Possum on Twitter. Brett, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much, and great to chat. And I hope you all enjoy the book.